What an absolutely unhinged, surreal day in British politics we have all just witnessed over the weekend. As you know, as we talked about yesterday, Dominic Cummings, it was revealed he broke the lockdown that has put the government on the ropes. He was sent out today, an incredibly unusual move to have a SPAD, a special advisor, give an hour-long press conference in front of the nation's media. It happened. We basically learned nothing new whatsoever, except that this government is completely shameless and is taking us all for fools. Then at 7 p.m., Boris Johnson came out. And I mean, it was kind of the most Trumpian I've seen him, ignoring all questions, not even attempting to give any kind of credible answer. I am joined to talk about this phenomenal day. Phenomenal is too kind a word, but it's been horrific in a way. Ash Sarkar and Aaron Bastani. How are you? Have you been glued to your television screens for this sort of shit show? I think is probably all we can call it. Since about 4 p.m. today, wasn't it?
I feel like I've been mainlining a new David Lynch series. You know, it's just like unhinged event after unhinged event, and every time I think I've got a grip on this new reality, someone comes like crawling out of the mirror or something. It was completely bizarre, and it was made more bizarre by going on talk radio with Darren Grimes. And you go on talk radio and it's like you've entered an alternate reality. So you've got the host telling you everyone's going to think that Dominic Cummings did a fantastic job. He's going to be feeling really positive. This is a triumph, isn't it? And I was like, what have you been watching? Has there been something completely different from me? Do I no longer have a grip on my own reality? So that's where I am today.
Aaron, your instant reaction to this day we've all just witnessed?
Yeah, the weirdest thing is they don't need to do this. Like, he could just be a little bit contrite and apologetic and say, look, it was a judgment call. I was sick. You might disagree. Maybe you could say we sort of infringed the spirit of the laws, but I did nothing illegal. And I did nothing, I think, that was morally wrong. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. He could have done that. And it doesn't make that much sense. Even Alistair Campbell with the Hutton inquiry, after Dr. David Kelly killed himself in 2003, Alistair Campbell offered his resignation to Charlie Faulkner and Tony Blair. And what we learned from today's kind of, it wasn't a press conference, this kind of statement that he gave, he said at no point did he consider resigning. And that's kind of what you don't need to do this. Like, you should try and at least try and cultivate a little bit of empathy from the public at large, but they're not even trying to do that. It's a really weird moment. And maybe we can talk about why they're doing this and how I don't think ultimately it's in their advantage.
It was a weird moment. It's a weird press conference, and we are going to go through it blow by blow. We're going to go through the Cummings one first, then Boris Johnson's, then talking about the broader issues and a couple of other stories from the day. First of all, make sure you share the stream. We want to get more people watching this live, and tweet on the hashtag #TiskiSour. So to introduce the Dominic Cummings press conference today, there was sort of a flurry of speculation on Twitter that the reason Dominic Cummings was going to come out is because he had, well, under his sleeve is potentially an odd way to put it, but he had this fact which we hadn't yet known or understood, which meant what he had done would seem comprehensible and would seem justified. And what people have been suggesting is that potentially his son had a learning difficulty, maybe he was autistic, and that meant that the fact he had to go 270 miles to his grandparents was somehow justifiable because the kid is not used to being with people he's less familiar with. Now, there were plenty of criticisms that could have been made of using that excuse to drive 270 miles. Many people have made those criticisms online. But what actually happened was there was no big reveal. Very few excuses whatsoever were given that hold any weight. We're going to start with this clip, which is him trying to explain why he was justified in driving 270 miles with coronavirus.
For years I have warned of the dangers of pandemics. Last year I wrote about the possible threat of coronaviruses and the urgent need for planning. The truth is that I had argued for lockdown. I did not oppose it. But these stories had created a very bad atmosphere around my home. I was subject to threats of violence. People came to my house shouting threats. There were posts on social media encouraging attacks. There were many media reports on TV showing pictures of my house. I was also worried that given the severity of this emergency, this situation would get worse. And I was worried about the possibility of leaving my wife and child at home all day and often into the night while I worked in number 10. I thought the best thing to do in all the circumstances was to drive to an isolated cottage on my father's farm.
So no, it wasn't a particular need that his child had. It was basically because Dominic Cummings is famous. Some people have written some bad things about him, and then some people have shouted at him at his house. Now, I don't know if anyone else's experience of lockdown was completely different to mine, but I didn't see any roving protests of angry mobs trying to threaten people in their homes. The streets were completely empty. And also, I mean, if you are a public figure and you're worried that people are going to cause concerns outside your house, you can always call the police, right? You don't have to drive 270 miles with coronavirus in the middle of a pandemic. It does not stack up. I mean, also worth mentioning that Vuvuzela in the background was really weird, wasn't it? It kind of reminded me of those big Brexit, again, very surreal moments which we've had in British politics over the last 2 years. So also odd, actually, that my sense, whenever there's been a political crisis, because it's been so long since 2017, is that political crisis, we're going to have an election. It's really weird to have political crisis, but we've got them for 4.5 years anyway. But I suppose on that, we're going to go through it bit by bit. But first, some comments on that particular point. Was he justified? I'm going to know the answer, but we have to do this. Was he justified in going all the way to Durham just because some people had written bad things about him in a newspaper? Will people find that credible?
No, it's not credible. And I'll explain why it's not credible. So, at the time of Dominic Cummings' illness, it was the height of the lockdown, right? We're really thinking about the peak in terms of infections, deaths, and the level of restrictions governing the British public. So there were not roving mobs. I heard no reports of that. What's happened is that because of the uproar yesterday with the Led by Donkeys protest, the footage of people heckling Dominic Cummings, what government outriders have done is created a Mobius strip defence. So they've folded time back on itself. And the argument essentially is that because his neighbours were angry, visibly, at him having broken the lockdown and driven 270 miles to County Durham, he had to break lockdown and make his neighbours angry by driving 264 miles or whatever it is from London to County Durham. So they've literally inverted the laws of linear time to make this argument work. And the reason why they're hoping it does is because those are more recent images that people have seen, and so it sticks in people's minds. But it's completely absurd. This morning I was on Twitter and I tweeted something perfectly innocuous about some of that footage, saying this demonstrates that there's real cut through here. And I've suddenly got Philip Blonde and Alex Dean saying it's disgusting that I'm taking pleasure in it. Near identical wording. So I do actually think that this is something which was being trialed by, key right-wing conservative outriders earlier in the day, and they thought, right, this is going to be one of the main things that we put in there because those images are fresh, and so it will seem justified.
Okay, let's go through some more key moments from that speech. So not only did he fail to offer justifications for the infractions we knew about, he also introduced new ones, right? So in his explanation, he revealed that after his wife became sick, he went back to work. So this is when the principal advice we were all being given was, obviously don't leave your home, but also if anyone is suffering from symptoms of coronavirus, stay at home, don't go back to work. He went back to work. Since that speech, they've sort of clarified to say, they weren't quite symptoms of coronavirus. But I mean, she was ill in the middle of a pandemic. Everyone that Dominic Cummings had been working with had coronavirus. It was quite easy to join the dots. Also, during his period of self-isolation, he went for a walk in the woods. Don't worry, his dad owned the woods, which is supposed to make it more acceptable, but not many people had that privilege of when they're locking down for 14 days, they get to have a nice walk among nature. And actually, this is the most serious one, the most serious health impact that his trip could have had, which is his child fell ill on the 2nd of April. And his wife, then suffering from COVID symptoms, took him to hospital. Ultimately, Cummings, who was still within the isolation period, went to pick him up from hospital. Now, obviously, it's acceptable if your kid is ill to take them to hospital. But you have to put this in context, which is that Dominic Cummings was coming from London with coronavirus symptoms. London at this point in time was the COVID hotspot, to a part of the country with very low levels of COVID-19, the Northeast at that point in time. And then their family were going to a hospital in the Northeast. And this is the principal reason why the government guidelines tell you to not move from one part of the country to another part of the country, because what you can do is seed COVID-19 from a place with a high level of coronavirus into a part of the country with a very low level of coronavirus. And that is exactly what they did. Not only does that seed the virus, but it can also put stresses on health services in rural areas, which is precisely where he was. So this is what it was designed to do. I'm just going to go to one more video before going to you, Aaron. So then there was also one more explanation. This was probably what's going to be remembered most from this press conference, actually, which is that one of the other revelations about Dominic Cummings was not only he went to Durham to self-isolate in this house, but also he went for a day trip to Barnard Castle, which is a picturesque town 30 miles drive from his home, or his parents' home in Durham. This was on the 12th of April. And this is the reason he gave as to why he had to make this trip.
On Sunday, the 12th of April, 15 days after I first displayed symptoms, I decided to return to work. My wife was very worried, particularly given my eyesight had seemed to have been affected by the disease. She did not want to risk a nearly 300-mile drive with our child, given how ill I had been. We agreed that we should go for a short drive to see if I could drive safely. We drove for roughly half an hour and ended up on the outskirts of Barnard Castle town. We did not visit the castle, we did not walk around the town. We parked by a river. My wife and I discussed the situation. We agreed that I could drive safely, we should turn around and go home. I felt a bit sick. We walked about 10 to 15 meters from the car to the riverbank nearby. We sat there for about 15 minutes. We had no interactions with anybody. I felt better. We returned to the car. An elderly gentleman walking nearby appeared to recognize me. My wife wished him happy Easter from a distance, but we had no other interaction.
So the reason he had to drive on a 60-mile round trip to a picturesque part of the Northeast was to test his eyesight. Aaron.
I just want to rewind a bit here. Let's get down to some brass tacks. He says his wife, Mary Wakefield, was exhibiting symptoms on the 27th of March. But that didn't include a sore throat or a cough, which are, of course, they're the two primary symptoms of COVID-19. So what symptoms was she exhibiting? On the 27th, he left work. He went to go see his wife. She said, I'm so worried that I won't be able to look after our kid at the moment. And I think I may have COVID-19, even though she didn't have these two leading symptoms. I think it's a really, really important question to ask. Well, what symptoms did she have? Which Dominic Cummings, this is a senior person in government, paid a hell of a lot of money to do a really important job, for him to then say, well, you've probably got it. That means I've probably got it. That means our child's probably got it. So she didn't have those two leading symptoms. What were they? Then yesterday, Boris Johnson says, well, Dominic Cummings was on the brink of being incapacitated, so he had to go to Durham. Wait, he's not showing any symptoms. His wife is showing some symptoms, but they're not the symptoms normally associated with COVID-19. Nobody's actually asking what those symptoms were. And now you're saying he was on the brink of being incapacitated. Furthermore, Dominic Cummings has said, well, our normal avenues of childcare weren't available. What were they? Why not? You know, I'm not a big fan of the Keir Starmer, let's have an inquiry, because I think having an inquiry about somebody taking a drive, however long or politically important, is probably the most English thing imaginable. But I do think there are certain questions here which need to be answered. And actually, you know what? Under oath, cross-examined with a judge, maybe not a bad idea. And finally, the child going to the hospital point. On the 2nd of April, Dominic Cummings said he could barely get up to walk. And yet on the 3rd of April, he's okay to pick his wife and son up from hospital because he says no taxis were available. Really? How come? Why? And so I think, generally speaking, this alibi or set of alibis has got more holes in it than a piece of Swiss cheese munched on by several rodents. It doesn't add up. And there's so much bullshit here. There are so many misrepresentations. It kind of takes you a little while to work your way through it. But after a while, you say, look, I can give you the benefit of the doubt for 1, 2, 3 things. But, you know, it looks here like we've got misrepresentation piled on misrepresentation. And I think we'll make that clear by the end of the show. This does not stand up, and he certainly shouldn't still be in a job.
Mm. I mean, I think it's almost, I agree with all of that, but it's almost more than that, because even on the face of it, the story, even as he wants us to accept it happened, is not in any way justifiable. I mean, we'll get onto that in a moment. First of all, Ash, this driving to Barnard Castle to test his eyes. What did you make of that particular excuse?
Well, I thought it was a very reasonable and plausible excuse. Who amongst us, if we were sincerely worried about whether or not it was safe for us to drive because of failing eyesight, wouldn't take our 4-year-old child, put them in the back seat, put our wife in the front seat, and go driving off for at least an hour-long round trip to a natural beauty spot? That's how I would check whether or not it was safe for me to drive. I would stake the life of my beloved child just to raise the stakes enough to make sure I'm really serious about driving safely. You know?
I'm going to interrupt you very quickly, Ash, just to say, can you put your mic up a little bit?
Ooh.
Point it up a bit. Yeah.
There
perfect.
we go.
Then
Okay.
continue. That sounds great.
All right, beautiful. Well, you know what? Again, I just wanted to make you work for the content. So this story doesn't add up. He's a concerned father who, anticipating that there might be a discontinuity in childcare, drove 260 miles because he was so concerned for his son's well-being. However, when it came to seeing whether or not it was safe for him to drive, put his 4-year-old son in the back of the car and went for a drive of at least an hour long. Doesn't make sense. Does not make sense on any level.
There's also a very key fact, which I'm very actually surprised that none of the journalists brought up in the press conference with Dominic Cummings, which is that the day he drove to Barnard Castle, I don't know how you pronounce it, to test his eyes, which is not something people do anyway. If you want to test your eyes, you don't get your family in a car and drive for half an hour. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But potentially that trip to this picturesque town makes more sense with the detail that the 12th of April is Dominic Cummings' wife's birthday. Right, so we're supposed to believe that
it's the perfect day for an eye test.
Yes, it's you know, everyone else in the country was showing so much restraint to not go to the funerals of loved ones who had not died, to not visit their families who were sick, right? And this guy went for or just to stay in when it was their birthday, you know, minor things as well. And this guy went to a picturesque town. He's the government's chief advisor, breaking the lockdown for his wife's birthday. It's phenomenal. You could not make it up.
Can I just very briefly spell out what happened? So Dominic Cummings himself admits that when his wife alerted him that she was feeling very, very ill, he left work, saw her. She'd been saying that she felt like she was going to pass out. Sure, she didn't have the cough and the fever, allegedly, at that time, but we knew that extreme fatigue was one of the coronavirus symptoms at that time. And he then went back to work. So there, you've got a breach of the rules, because immediately you were supposed to self-isolate as an entire household and not break that isolation for 14 days. You don't have I just forgot the hole puncher at work excuse, right? There's not that kind of caveat. That's the first breach. Even if we accept this idea that there is some kind of childcare exemption and that's why he had to go 260 miles to County Durham, let's just brush over that for a second. Although, again, I don't think that that's a valid excuse. And I also don't think it's believable that he went on a full tank of petrol and didn't have to stop to go to the toilet with a 4-year-old in the car. But that's for another day. You've got this trip to Barnard Castle where they have stopped at a river to sit down, which you're not supposed to do. They shouldn't have been, leaving the house, but they stopped at a river, got back in the car, stopped the car again and got out at some woods because apparently the 4-year-old needed the toilet, and they got out and played for a while. So again, that's a non-essential journey. It's not for exercise. It's shortly after they've been very ill indeed. I think rather conveniently, they were saying this was on day 15. So it was just outside the 14-day isolation window. And again, right, that's another very, very clear breach. And so what I don't understand is how this sort of avalanche of detail is supposed to exonerate him. In fact, it condemns him. These are really clear, ways in which the lockdown guidance has been contravened. And I simply don't understand why, Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson cooked that up and went, yep, that's me, exonerated off the hook.
Let's go to one of the questions and answers, because this is when so Dominic Cummings was asked by Gary Gibbon from Channel 4 why if what he did was within the regulations, no one else knew that was the regulation. So if he has, spun this story where driving 270 miles because you're worried you and your partner are both going to be incapacitated, even though you're still not sure if either of you have coronavirus. And so, if this whole story sounded like is following the rules to Dominic Cummings, why did no one else know that these were the rules?
With great respect, Gary.
Who else has driven that distance?
I'm trying to answer the question. With great respect, it's not just a simple matter in the regulations. The regulations describe various exceptional circumstances where it may not be possible to follow the rules. It doesn't say you must stay at home in all circumstances. It says that there are some circumstances in which you won't be able to follow these rules. And it seemed to me that I was in such an exceptional circumstance, and I was trying to balance all of these very complicated things.
People will be staggered to hear you say that when the message was so clear: stay home. Is the fact that the Prime Minister can't do his job without you?
The guidance says, if you are living with children, I'm reading out the actual guidance. If you're living with children, keep following this advice to the best of your ability. However, we are aware that not all these measures will be possible.
I mean, he's still maintaining he was in an exceptional circumstance.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, go on.
Aaron's trumping at the bit. We should definitely.
He's saying it was an exceptional circumstance. We were so worried. My son, like Billy Zane in the final scene of Titanic, I have a child. And yet we know after he went to the cottage on his family farm, he never had any help with childcare. They were fine. They could have done exactly what they did at home in London. And he said, well, I had my sister, she could drop off groceries. Hello, Tesco can do that, Ocado can do that. Or are you such an anti-elitist that despite living in a multi-million-pound London house, you're going to pretend that doesn't exist and you've never done it before? I'm calling bullshit. So this whole thing about these were such incredible, intense, extenuating circumstances. Well, if that was the case, then how come you and your wife were perfectly fine in administering childcare, which I'm really happy about, by the way. That's great because many people couldn't. That surely proves the fact that they didn't look after your son, the fact that they never entered this cottage, according to you, that would prove you didn't have to do this. So the idea that you should be able to do this would, if that was to be generalized as a kind of, as a loophole, hundreds of thousands, millions of people would be able to travel across the country. Because it turns out it actually wasn't that extenuating a circumstance. So like Ash has said, this is not a set of alibis. This is like a charge sheet, but you're reading it and thinking it gets you out of jail. And there's 4, 5, 6 instances of it. Crazy.
So it's completely insulting to everyone's intelligence. So that bit that he was reading out of, not all of this will be possible if you've got very small children. You should be following these rules to the best of your ability. Within the context, it's pretty clear that what that's referring to is self-isolating within a house. Mm-hmm. And what you're trying to do is keep clearly infected people away from people who aren't infected by keeping them in different rooms. Within the context, that's what it refers to. But because there's this gap in the wording, and it doesn't say, we are explicitly referring to this part, he's now wielding it as though it's some kind of, a legalistic fig leaf for his own wrongdoing. And when it comes to this idea of safeguarding exemptions, because that was the very specific word that was used in Grant Shapps' press conference, was safeguarding, was I spoke to a social worker, because the word safeguarding doesn't just mean whatever you want it to. It's got very specific applicability when it comes to child protection. So I spoke to a social worker, and I promise it wasn't my mum. It was one of the few social workers who I'm not directly related to. And I said, as someone who works at, in children's social care, what does safeguarding and being exempt from lockdown rules mean to you? And she said, it's very clear that it applies to cases of abuse, neglect, or a significant deterioration in the safety of a child. So it doesn't just refer to, conditions or an environment which temporarily might be considered suboptimal. So less playtime with your child or less engagement with your child. It means that there's a significant deterioration in their safety or a significant escalation in risk. And one of the reasons why there's so much emphasis on significant deterioration of safety or significant escalation of risk is because for so many people who work directly in children's social care, the conditions in which these children are already living is already suboptimal. So they've got to work out very, very carefully how they balance these different kinds of safeguarding needs, safety from the virus and also safety from unsafe living situations. So it was completely inappropriate for that language to be wielded by Dominic Cummings in this circumstance. And in particular, when they didn't need any of this much vaunted help with childcare from his 17-year-old niece and from his sister. And I think that comes back to what you said, Michael, which is now, after the fact, they're having to come up with more and more and more elaborate narratives around each individual breach of the lockdown rules because it's covering one central truth. And the central truth is, I had a nicer place to stay than London. And unlike you, Pauls, I could take myself up there to my father's estate with its private wood and its lovely cottage and have fun there with my family through what's quite a difficult time. That's what was going on.
It's also worth pointing out that the bit of the rules which he was referring to think that sort of excused what he'd done, says, if you have young children, follow these to the best of your ability. And when you read it in the document, it's quite clear what they mean is follow these social distancing rules within your house to the best of your ability. So, but you can have a liberal reading which says that, yeah, follow it to the best of your ability, which may include leaving the house. But can you really suggest that two well-connected people in London, them following the rules to the best of their ability? You've got to remember that neither of them, this was all on the hypothetical that they were both to become completely incapacitated at the same time. That's very rare. Like, you know, the chances of that are very low. And so following those rules to the best of your ability is saying, look, basically, we're probably going to be fine to just self-isolate here for 14 days. We won't see anyone else. We'll just do what everyone else is doing. But it's probably sensible for everyone to come up with some kind of backup, if you're two parents of one child, to say, if we both get close to incapacitated, is there some person in the local area who there's a sort of 1 in 100 chance that we'll have to call up to pick up a child? That's following the rules to the best of your ability. That's not what they did. Aaron.
No, that's entirely right. Again, it's just compound what you've just said and Ash has just said. It basically, they said, look, this is going to be tough. You can see how this works out. On the 27th, Mary Wakefield gets sick. Dominic Cummings goes to work after she sort of informs him that she's sick. He probably shouldn't have done that. They think, well, we're probably both going to be sick. Our son's going to be sick. We have to bear in mind government policy tacitly until 2 weeks earlier was herd immunity. They think, well, we've got no comorbidities. Probably good to get a bit of immunity to this. I mean, this is the most plausible sort of sequence of events. Okay, well, we can just go self-isolate in my dad's cottage in Durham. And that'd be, like Ash says, a much more pleasant, comfortable experience than in London. And worst comes to worst, yeah, we've kind of got our backsides covered. But like you say, the chance of them both being utterly incapacitated, it's just like hysterical. Yeah, of course, it's entirely possible that any family both parents could get coronavirus, both at the same time, both end up in ICU, and a 4-year-old child can't be looked after. But that's plausible for millions of people. So is that the basis therefore, where, you know, you can rationally infer that it's a legitimate thing to go across the country, but not just go across the country, not just go 260 miles across the country, as we've already said, several days later, to take your son to a hospital, Mary Wakefield, Dominic Cummings' wife, took the son to the hospital, and actually take a person from a high-intensity area, London, which was experiencing an incredible amount of cases, including theirs possibly, and then taking them to Durham. And one more thing, by the way, Dominic Cummings' son, he said today, didn't test positive for coronavirus. So even though he showed some symptoms, he didn't have the coronavirus. What I think I would love to see is, did Mary Wakefield and Dominic Cummings ever have it? You know, we have these antibodies tests now. Let's find out if they actually had it, because I think I really think that's open. I mean, if the son was tested, he was showing the symptoms, but it turns out those tests were negative. I mean, it's a rational inference to say, well, perhaps neither of them were positive either. In which case, you've had 3 people, including a senior government advisor, completely undermining the rules with absolutely no justification whatsoever. Because we've talked about all the things we've talked about. They were absolutely fine doing what they did in London. They never needed the parents anyway. And guess what? Maybe they never even had it.
We're going to go to another clip. This is when Dominic Cummings is sort of called up on this excuse of going for a drive to test his eyesight. We're going to take a look at that now.
Why do you have to make a half-hour journey each way to Barnard Castle? Why not drive a little bit of the way to London and then go back if you weren't feeling well?
I mean, we didn't think about that of doing that. To be honest, we just thought, okay, let's whiz down the road and see how I feel.
Do you regret not thinking about it?
Do you mean, do I regret not just trying to drive to London and see if I can do it?
Do you regret taking a half-hour journey to Barnard Castle and sitting for 15 minutes, as you say?
As I said, I think it was a reasonable thing to do. I mean, perhaps you're right, and we should just have cracked on and tried to do the whole trip, but the whole point was, no, I had been extremely ill. My vision had been a bit weird. We were all going to go back. My wife said we should drive down the road and you should see if you can actually drive and see if your vision is weird or if you're okay. And I thought that's a good idea. I should do. And as I stressed, I'd been cleared to go back to work, so the implication that I shouldn't have been driving back to London, I don't think is reasonable, because I had spoken to a doctor about it and I had been cleared to come back to work.
You don't drive to test your eyes. That's a bad idea. Also, something that was really interesting about that clip was that he kept focusing on things. He kept trying to justify things that no one's actually upset about. So he's like, the doctor said it was fine to drive back to London. No one's pissed off you drove back to London. They're pissed off you drove to Durham in the first place. So what? Do you know what I mean? And there was loads of that, which is actually relevant. Let's just go straight on to the next clip, which is him trying to sort of reframe this narrative as one where people have been misinformed. He hasn't really done anything wrong. Let's take a look.
As I said, I think there is understandable anger, but a lot of that anger is based on reports in the media that have not been true, and it's extremely regrettable. But the media that were reporting some of these things that were wrong were told that they were wrong, but they reported them anyway, and that has caused a lot. That has caused a lot of anger. I know a lot of people have shouted at me in the street. Why did you go back? Why did you go back to see your parents just because you wanted to? But I did not do that.
So is this actually, Boris Johnson will probably see it in a moment as well. They've both tried to use basically the Brexit playbook, which is to look at the newspapers and call it fake news. And they have found a couple of details in the stories which potentially they have evidence didn't happen, or at least can plausibly deny didn't happen. So one of them is going back up to Durham a second time. It seems like he does have evidence that didn't happen. Others are things sort of like that he ever spoke or got close to his parents. But what all of this completely ignores is that what the whole country have watched is someone confirm that all the main parts of the story that they're actually annoyed about are true. So you can't stand there and say all of the main parts are true, or everything that you're annoyed about I've done, but there's a couple of details on the side that aren't true. Therefore, can you please get distracted about these couple of details? It's like he just doesn't understand why people are annoyed, or unless it's faux ignorance. I don't know. Where do you come on this, actually? Is there some master plan here, or are they out of their depth?
I think they're making it up as they go along, but that doesn't mean that it won't necessarily be effective if the heat manages to die down and that's under control. And I think most importantly, the sort of anger amongst the Conservative benches dies down. And so that element that's really driving the story through the establishment media isn't there anymore. But I think what we saw today is that was a very carefully worded and constructed statement. There was no room for error on certain points. And those certain points were this kind of Schrodinger's coronavirus, where they both did and didn't have it at the point of departure. There was this Barnard Castle trip and the very precise reasons why it had to happen. And there was the fact that he did not communicate with the Prime Minister that he was going to go to Durham. And it's something which insulates Boris Johnson from being complicit in what is at minimum, something which is completely anathema to the spirit of the lockdown rules, and at most actually breaking the law. So within that, you have this very strange delivery of trying to provide what you might call empathetic detail. So stuff which could change the public perception of where the story is going within a very, very narrow and tight framework, which is sort of necessitated by steering clear of anything that would admit legal culpability or would produce political problems, particularly for Boris Johnson. And so that's why you get these very strange moments where someone tries to ask a very specific question and he goes back down to like, well, there's this post-it which says something else. And I know it's safe to say that, so I'm going to say that. And it's very, very, very bizarre because the very natural thing to do and the very human thing to do would go, you know what, I made a mistake, I fucked up. But people do that when they're scared and they do that when their family's involved. And that's what happened with me. And I think through a combination of being politically hamstrung by how hard the government went on delegitimizing Neil Ferguson and forcing his resignation, and is also his natural pride and inability to admit that he was wrong, meant that those two options were impossible. So you were left with this third option, which basically treats the public with utter contempt, right? It assumes that we're all pebble-eating idiots who can't tie up their own shoelaces in the morning, and implicitly says, all of you who didn't look for these loopholes are worse parents than I am. And so that's a very dicey game to play because, yes, now you've had this sort of big and frankly bizarre set piece in the Rose Garden. You might get some of the heat moderated from your backbenchers. There are going to be lots of people in the country at large going, I had to do harder things with less support. Why couldn't you cope with your situation? And why are you telling me I was a bad parent for going through all that?
We're going to go to some super chats. We've got over 4,000 watching, 4,400 watching, 1.2k likes. Like the video. Make sure you are subscribed. That's my main ask, actually, because we go live 3 times a week. All the shows have this much energy, but we are getting a lot of super chats tonight. And I can tell when we get a lot of super chats that everyone is real pissed off at the political establishment and the mainstream media, and they want to support an alternative. So thank you so much for that. Let's go through some of them now. Pippa Tandy with a super chat with $50 Australian. Tom Cockcroft, $48.99, a nice exact figure. You guys rock. Keep going. Tom and Juliet, kisses back. Stephen Morris, 50 quid. Think we are all outraged by the hypocrisy of this. I think we should discuss how the Labour Party can weaponize this event. We will do that later, yes. 50 quid from Chris Hill. It really worries me that the PM and the thought leader of the ruling class can dissemble so blatantly and so effortlessly, and that they can clearly think they can get away with this. Why are most journalists not asking obvious questions? They often ask just too long, flowery, bizarre questions. Chris Wellbrook with $9.99. Thank you very much. Keep up the fantastic work, Novara. I've been at work. I'm a teacher supporting the essential childcare service, and I come home to this this slot show. Is loosening of lockdown being accelerated by this? We will talk about that in detail later, but yes, I think. Oh, this shit show. So it wasn't about us. It was about we're not the shit show, presumably. And
not anymore.
Red Hot Melter with a £10 super chat. Dominic Cummings press conference for over an hour in the Rose Garden, Downing Street, showing us all he's the real unelected prime minister. Actually, that last one is a good segue to the next discussion, because watching that Downing Street briefing by Dominic Cummings, obviously it was in the Rose Garden, not in the normal briefing room. The thought I was having is what's the purpose of this? What do they think they're achieving by this? Because I thought the purpose was they were going to reveal some new information which would make Dominic Cummings' situation seem more muddy. Seem like there were questions potentially of vulnerability about the child. That didn't happen. But it was when Boris Johnson came out at 7 p.m. for his press conference where some of that became clear. And it became clear because Boris Johnson in that conference was very clear, especially to an answer to Robert Peston, which we don't have. It wasn't the most interesting answer, but it was him saying, if you've got a question about what Dominic Cummings has done, you've just had a press conference with Dominic Cummings, so you can ask Dominic Cummings. So it's this idea of saying, because you've now had this direct one-to-one with Dominic Cummings where he told real crap excuses, this is no longer my problem. You can go direct to him. Or you had your opportunity to go direct to him, and now we can move on. You've seen all the Tory cabinet also say he's given lots of detail. Their word today was detail. He's given a comprehensive account and lots of detail. Let's now move on. Anyway, let's go to that press conference today. We've got some clips from it, and it was the most outrageous I've seen Boris Johnson, to the extent that he was just so willing to lie. Before we go to that, Aaron, you want to come in?
I just want to say a few quick things, just kind of round up. Firstly, Ash is absolutely right. They're trying to insulate Boris Johnson here. Did Dominic Cummings tell Dominic Raab? Dominic Cummings has said, well, certain senior people knew in 10 Downing Street when I said I was leaving to go to Durham. Who? Who's in charge? You know, we're in the middle of a national pandemic. 35,000 people have died. I think if we're going to examine a broader story here of a failure of leadership and organisation at the very highest levels of government, that's probably quite an important question to answer. Secondly, there are lots of little lies where he just doesn't need to lie. So he says, oh, the hospital where we dropped off my son was 5 miles away from the family farm, or maybe it was 2, 3, 4 miles. Okay. And then when he talks about this place, Barnard Castle, where they drove to test his eyesight, he said, oh, it's only a short drive. Then it was a half an hour drive. It turns out it's about a 45-minute drive on a good day. And so I just think this is a real giveaway. It is often when somebody just lies about small, minor details. It shows that there isn't a concrete story here.
Let's go to some of these answers first. So we'll go straight to the... Often in these press conferences now, that what they say at the beginning is pointless and we're only there for the question and answer. We're going to go to an answer to Lucy Fisher from The Times. So she asked, Boris Johnson, is your backing for Dominic Cummings conditional, unconditional, or if it becomes clear he's undermining compliance with public health messaging, will he go?
No, I can't give any unconditional backing to anybody, but I do not believe that anybody in Number 10 has done anything to undermine our messaging. What we want to make absolutely clear to the public is that the only way to solve this problem is if we stay alert, follow the guidelines, control the virus, and save lives. And that has been immensely effective so far.
I mean, he's doubling down there. He's saying the messaging has not been undermined whatsoever. No apology. They're going to try and ride this out. My guess is they think it's 4.5 years into general election. Who cares if we undermine the lockdown? Because we need Dominic Cummings and people will forget about this in a little while. Let's go straight actually to the other clip we have from this conference, which is when Rowena Mason from The Guardian asks about that 60-mile round trip to test Cummings' eyesight and if Boris Johnson thinks that's reasonable and if the public will think that's reasonable. Let's take a look.
Prime Minister, are you expecting millions of people around the country to believe that Dominic Cummings needed to take a 60-mile round trip to a local beauty spot with his wife and child just to test his eyesight? And secondly, Conservative MPs, at least 20 of them, senior clergy, scientists, medics, lawyers and many, many constituents from across the political spectrum all believe that Mr Cummings should quit for his actions. Are they all wrong?
Look, I can't go into... go back over what you've heard this afternoon, but on the point about eyesight, I might just say I'm finding I have to wear spectacles for the first time in years because of I think because of the effects of this thing. So I'm inclined to think there's some I think that's very, very plausible that there's that eyesight can be a problem associated with coronavirus.
I mean, he has taken us. This is a really serious issue, right? This is coronavirus. It's killed 55,000 people, partly because of his mistakes, or very, very much largely because of his mistakes. And now a serious question is being asked: is it a reasonable thing? Your lead advisor. There are big holes in his story. People are going to wonder whether or not driving 60 miles to test your eyes is a good idea. And then he ignores the question, gets out his glasses, and essentially kind of makes a joke, right? He doesn't even bother to attempt to answer the question. And I don't know, this might have worked for him when the question was garden bridges or, petty things, the shape of buses. But is this really going to work when the issue is the lockdown, how effective it's going to be? And, well, so clearly a matter of life and death when people have gone through such trauma to sort of get to this point in time, and he could be so frivolous and so offensive, really standing up there. I mean, well, how is this going to escalate?
I mean, so there's a lot at stake here. And I think a lot of people mischaracterize my position personally, but also this happens for many people on the left when it comes to the government during coronavirus. I don't want the government to do a bad job, because them doing a bad job means that more people will die. And that could be my friends, that could be my family members, right? It could be people that I love very dearly. So I actually want the government to be on top of its job, handling this well, and then I can go back to trying to, dislodge them from power at every turn. And the problem with this failure to address the glaring inaccuracies in Dominic Cummings' story is that it breaks down trust between the public and the government right at the time where we need full transparency and we need to have total confidence in what it is they're telling us to do. And I'll give you two examples where what's come out today has flown in the face of what Downing Street has explicitly been telling us over the past few days. So when it was first alleged that police had made contact with the Cummings family, it was flatly denied by Downing Street and reiterated by Grant Shapps. It was then completely contradicted by Durham Police and then contradicted again today, who said that police did make contact with Dominic Cummings' father. And then just yesterday, the whole, Barnard Castle thing was dismissed by Boris Johnson. And then that admission of taking a drive to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight becomes, one of the core parts of Dominic Cummings' story today. And so if we can't trust the government to tell us the truth when the truth is politically inconvenient, that breaks down the really essential consent and covenant, if you will, between the public and government during a time of national crisis. And that will have knock-on effects down the line. So it might result in smaller behavioral changes that we're seeing even now. So people doing more things like mixing between households or traveling further afield. So doing things which undermine the attempts to contain and ameliorate the spread of the virus. And then as we look towards having a contact tracing app being launched, and you have people being instructed, regardless of how they might personally feel or what they think about the people that they've come into contact with, that they should self-isolate because they've come into contact with someone who's tested positive for COVID-19, well, I imagine a lot of people will feel a lot less serious about that. Because why should they do what they've been told when one of the most senior figures in government refuses to do it? And why shouldn't they create little loopholes from themselves of like, well, I've been told to self-isolate, but why can't I do that, back at my mum's house, which is a lot nicer? Or, well, why shouldn't I do that at this like lovely empty bargain Airbnb in Cornwall? And all of these things will add up, and they'll add up to a higher rate of infection than we would have had before. And tragically, it may well result in completely avoidable deaths.
Let's go to actually some of the. Let's go on, Aaron.
I just want to. I think it sort of repeats what we've said a few times here about there is a recency bias being committed. Recency bias is when you look at the most recently available data. So Brexiteers are saying, well, this is just like Brexit because, of course, Brexit was only 6 months ago and Dominic Cummings will be fine. He'll get away with it. Of course, Dominic Cummings further back lost his job when he worked for Michael Gove. The reason why I don't think this is like Brexit, and the reason why I don't think the Tories just get away with it, is because with Brexit, you had that Linton Crosby style wedge issue, and a significant part of the population, not a majority, but a sizable minority, felt personally invested in a certain outcome. And with the coronavirus, like Asha said, nobody is siding with coronavirus. Nobody is siding with the lockdown. I love lockdown. I love the fact that all the local businesses, I love to go to the cafes, the bookshops, the clothes. I love they're all shut. I love the fact they can go out of business. Nobody's saying this. And so that kind of that motif of the politics and the way that Dominic Cummings conducts it, of for and against, battle every day, win more than you lose, it just can't work because that battle isn't there. Nobody is rooting for coronavirus. I think it's a really important point to make. And I think the political and intellectual reputation of Dominic Cummings can be severely overstated. He called Brexit right because he correctly understood that a sizable minority of the British public, arguably a majority, are Eurosceptics. And that's been known for decades. You could have said that on the day that the referendum was called in, we knew it was going to happen in 2015, the day after the 2015 general election. We knew that. And I think sort of transposing this Mephistophean kind of Machiavellian, omniscient political genius that he apparently is, I don't think that's accurate. And I think here we're seeing his mindset work against him.
We're going to go to some sort of public responses to this chapter in Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings' rule. this whole controversy. And I think the most powerful ones really have come from members of the public who are talking about the sacrifices they have made during this period of time, which basically they feel like Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings have pissed all over by saying you should have just followed your instinct at the time. I'm going to start with a letter written by someone called John Wilson on Twitter. It's been retweeted almost 30,000 times. Obviously, it's really resonated. Let's get this up now. So this is to his MP. Mr. Smith, I have delayed writing to you for 15 hours to try and let my rage subside so that I can be coherent and civil. My wife died of COVID-19 in Stoke Mandeville Hospital on the 29th of March. Hospital lockdown prevented me from seeing her for 2 weeks before her death. On the day she died, I could not be with her to hold her hand. I just sat by the telephone. I was not able to see her body. Since then, I have stayed alone in the house, leaving only to collect her ashes and belongings from the undertaker, shop for food every couple of weeks, collect medication, post a parcel of condolence cards to her sister, who will pass them round the rest of the family, and walk for less than 1 hour a day. In other words, under severe mental and emotional distress, I, like the vast majority of the population, have complied with your government's instructions in order to protect my fellow citizens. I will spare you my opinion of the actions of the leader of your party yesterday. If you are in any doubt, let me know. I would like to know what your view is on this situation. I would like to know what, if anything, you intend to do about this. Please spare me the deepest sympathy, thoughts, and prayers stuff. We are beyond that after yesterday. John Wilson, Whitchurch. So it's clear that letter was a direct response to Boris Johnson's appalling press conference yesterday, where basically he was saying what Dominic Cummings did was right. It's what any good father would do. He was following his instincts. And I mean, talk radio, the whole country today has been saying, I made this sacrifice. Does that mean I should have just followed my instinct? Is he calling me a bad husband, a bad father, a bad what? It's just appalling. And this is, I think you're right, Aaron, which is that this is why this isn't like Brexit or any of the other wedge issues they've found. Because, I mean, a comparison that I saw made recently was about prorogation. And so then there was, people saying this is a complete outrage, et cetera, but that did end up just cutting along divides of the Remain Leave axis, because it was technical. It was the sort of constitutional issue going on in Westminster. I mean, people weren't that was a Westminster issue. This is not. People have made real sacrifices here, and their prime minister in this moment of crisis has shat all over them fundamentally. Let's go to one more before I go to you two for your reactions on these. So now we've got a tweet from Hannah Hazeman. Can we get that up? So she says, I went against instincts and listened to my father's last hours battling cancer via WhatsApp and phone instead of being by his side. But our PM, Boris Johnson, said it was acceptable for Dominic Cummings to visit his parents not once, but twice. I feel sick and ashamed. Probably it does seem like he only did visit his parents once, but I mean, obviously that point 100% holds. I'll go to you two. Who wants to come in on sort of like this outpouring of basically visceral, not just outrage, but also, I mean, people seem incredibly upset. There was someone calling into LBC today who was basically crying. I mean, she was crying on the phone because she said she had a disabled adult child, who was in a, non-verbal, was in a home, who she was terrified, felt that she'd abandoned her and she couldn't visit her because she was following the rules to keep our country safe, to keep her fellow citizens safe. And now they've just said, oh, you could have just used your instinct. We wouldn't have judged you if you did what was right for your kid.
I mean, what's disgusting about that, and it's something which has been encouraged, I think, by the very aggressive tone struck by the government and then explicitly proposed by some right-wing outriders, in particular people like Dan Hodges, is that what they've said is, well, if you would let government advice get between you and your parental instinct, you're not a good parent, or you're out of your mind, or you're stupid. And to think about what people have suffered. So you've had carers of disabled children and adult disabled children struggling either to take up that care alone, completely unsupported by whatever home help that they had before the lockdown, or enduring terrible separation and terrible worry as well that something might happen during that time. And it sticks in my throat in quite a visceral way to think that the most powerful people in the country are looking at those sacrifices and just spitting on them and saying, this was always in the advice. It's not my fault that you didn't take it up. We're being gaslit. were being had. It wasn't in the advice. If it was clearly in the advice, it's something that parents would have been informed about. There's no way that this exemption, had it existed, would have been so unknown amongst parents. There's simply no way. And so for the government, I think, to look at those people with such disdain is absolutely galling.
Can I just respond to that, Michael?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why people are angry is because the sacrifices have been absolutely phenomenal. It's not just the personal stories about caring for a child or a loved one, or can't talk to a grandparent or missing a funeral. Which obviously these are all horrific stories, but there are people who've spent 20 years building a business and it's disappeared. There are people, great story today, or not a great story, a big story today, 50 to 60 football clubs in the professional leagues of this country, from the Premier League to what's now called League Two. Of course, not many Premier League clubs are going to go bust. 50 to 60 clubs, also maybe including what used to be called the Vauxhall Conference, but that kind of elite of professional / semi-professional football, 50 to 60 of them could disappear. Now, that's huge. Often in many of these places, often towns, this will be the kind of civic hub, the cultural hub of the town. This will be a big employer. It will be one of the few places where people find shared kind of collective meaning. And so for 50 to 60 towns to lose that, for your entire high street, you go to your nearest high street now, and those businesses are opening. And the ones that do open, and God willing, let's hope as many of them do as possible, it will be because of the furlough scheme. It will be because of extended lines of credit, all sorts, business rates relief. But even with all of that, a lot of them are going to shut, a lot. And so people think, I've given up 20 years for something and it's gone. And the very guy at the top of government who was, overseeing these rules, the very same person decided to shoot off from London at the first possible opportunity. That will upset people. That will anger people. It will, what they're saying, it will cut through. That is so relatable in such a way. It's completely different to the prorogation stuff or the Brexit stuff. People have a meaningful way of understanding the story where they say, I have lost so much. This guy isn't even willing to stay indoors for a couple of weeks. And so I agree so much. It's completely different to Brexit. That's not to say, Labour are now going to win the next general election. We talked about this yesterday. The next general election is 4 years away, right? Even if Boris Johnson, for whatever reason, stepped down in the next month, the next year, the next 3 years, Rishi Sunak would still be a very formidable Tory leader. We're not saying that. What we're saying is this is a huge blow to the political credibility of this government. And I think in the short term, that means that Dominic Cummings will probably have to go. And what we've heard today, from various, maybe some of our contacts as well, as people are saying, if opinion polls do go south to the Tories, they probably will get rid of him, because what matters most to these people is winning. And that's why I don't think this is anything like the Brexit stuff. And the fact also, it can be personalised. There's a bad person here. It's Dominic Cummings. Often stories, the big structural stories, there's not actually a bad person. Often when people are attacking Donald Trump, they mean something else. They mean about a certain tendency in American political life. In this instance, it's very much a particular person has done something which is very wrong and hypocritical. And that's why I think he'll pay the price.
The only thing I'd add there is I think it's also Boris Johnson. I mean, from people I've heard sort of calling into LBC today, and much of these things we've just read out there, which people are talking about, it was Boris Johnson saying he was just being a good father, which really was just salt in the wounds for so many people. And I think people just found that so offensive and so disgusting. And to have a leader who so clearly is willing to lie, to gaslight the whole public just to protect one advisor, I mean, really puts his character on show.
But it's insulting to our intelligence. We can all see what's happened. The reason why the public are angry isn't because there's this little known exemption in the rules that we all missed. It's because we're being told that something which is plainly in contravention of the rules that we were all abiding by and the social values that we held to about subordinating our own individual desires to the collective good. It's just been completely, disregarded by one of the most powerful men in the country. And when we can see that something is so wrong, the government not only is refusing to offer an apology, is not only refusing to acknowledge that, this is deeply painful for the country, it's saying you are yourself wrong for thinking there's anything amiss here. So it's not just casting doubt on your experience of lockdown. It's saying your moral compass and the things that you feel to be true and you can see and you can make sense of in your social reality is not to be trusted. And that is a very grave insult, I think. And that's a very dangerous thing to pose to your public, to say what you feel to be right and wrong is completely incorrect.
Let's go through some of the other, or some of the people who've come out in opposition of Dominic Cummings and the move of Boris Johnson to just uncritically defend him, because as we've said, a general election isn't going to happen until for another 4.5 years. So whether or not Cummings and Johnson can survive, or whether this strategy, this position can hold, partly depends on other figures in the establishment. And part of that is the scientists, right? So up until this point in time, it frayed last week, the relationship between SAGE, it's the top body of scientific advisors, and the government. But I think it really could, at this point in time, explode, right? And you saw that yesterday with various high-profile members from SAGE tweeting that what had happened was a public health disaster. Let's first get up Stephen Riker's tweet. This was retweeted so many times. He sits on the behavioral subgroup of SAGE. So they're precisely the people who give the government advice on messaging and how things like the lockdown can work, basically, on the most fundamental level. So let's get up this tweet. As one of those involved in SPIB, so that's the scientific pandemic it's SPI, something infectious diseases. The B is the behavioral. The government advisory group on behavioral science. I can say that in a few short minutes tonight, Boris Johnson has trashed all the advice we have given on how to build trust and secure adherence to the measures necessary to control COVID-19. Then he goes on. Be open and honest, we said. Trashed. Respect the public, we said. Trashed. Ensure equity so everyone is treated the same, we said. Trashed. Be consistent, we said. Trashed. Make clear we're all in it together. Trashed. Right? So this is so clear. Oh, it's pandemic influenza. Sorry, that was the PI. This is so clear that everything they have been advising the government has been pissed on, right? And then you've got two more members of SAGE who come out completely supporting this statement. So Robert West and Susan Mishi, again, both people who sit on this behavioral science subsection of SAGE. And then also there's some of the modelers who have now come out against this. So Adam Kucharski, he's quite a high profile figure on the modeling subgroup of SAGE. He tweeted this yesterday. I spent this weekend refining our contract tracing analysis. One of the things that's always stood out is that for these targeted measures to work, we need public adherence to isolation quarantine to be very high. But I fear it's now going to be far more difficult to achieve this. Right. So he's saying our next step is a contract tracing system whereby people have to be really diligent in following the rules. If you've been in contact with someone with COVID-19, you go home and you stay there. You don't say, I mean, basically, if you were to follow Dominic Cummings' example, you get called by the contact tracers and they say you've been in touch with someone who's COVID positive. If you're following Dominic Cummings' example, what you'd say is like, oh, I'm about to get a bit sick. Where would be the best place for me to get sick? I'll get an Airbnb by the sea, because if I'm going to self-isolate, I'd like a nice view, right? And so it's a public health disaster for people when they get told they're probably coronavirus positive to then say, oh, well, maybe this is a perfect opportunity for me to travel across the country because I know I'm going to have to, buckle down for 14 days. That you could not have a worse example to set for people if what you want to do is control the spread of a virus. One final thing I'm going to bring up before going to you two. So obviously the two most, high-profile scientists in the country are Professor Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, and Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor. An interesting sort of anecdote today from Joe Pike, who's at Sky, I think. He said, Prof. Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance left number 10 at approximately 6:20 today. Earlier, we were told they would be appearing with the PM at the daily press conference. Why did they turn up for the presser and then leave? Have asked number 10 for comment. Apparently, what number 10 sort of followed up saying was that because so many of the questions were going to be about Dominic Cummings, he didn't really need those two at the podium. But if they're already there, I'm sure the press would have had some questions they would have liked to ask those two. So it does raise the possibility that the government weren't particularly confident that if Chris Whitty was asked the question, would you advise someone that if you've been in contact, if you think your partner has got symptoms of coronavirus, if you've been working with lots of people who've got coronavirus and you've got a young child, would you advise them to drive 270 miles to self-isolate in a different town, in a different building, which a member of their family owns. Do you think that's reasonable within the rules? Because if Chris Whitty answers that yes, it is, he has completely trashed his reputation as a professional. And the fact that they weren't confident putting them up there today, maybe that means we will see a revolt from some of these people. I mean, from Patrick Vallance, I think he's personally, he struck me as more of the stooge for the government. Chris Whitty seems like someone who I could imagine, having a bit more integrity than standing up there and saying Dominic Cummings has done nothing wrong.
Well, also, this is why it's so unusual that they weren't a part of the press conference, because one of the things Boris Johnson was announcing today was the reopening of non-essential retail on June 15th. So actually, you want some pretty serious and hard-hitting data on that. You want to see the modelling that's gone behind it, and you want to have some pretty robust detail of how that decision got made, because it's a huge step forward in terms of reopening the economy and changing the way in which many of us have been living day to day. And so I think it stands to reason that we would want to hear from two of the foremost scientific advisors how that decision was reached. So this whole thing of, well, we were preempting that most of the questions would be on Dominic Cummings, but at the same time, Boris Johnson at the press conference is saying, well, you've had your Cummings time. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't add up. And this is one more case where the government is being economical with the truth, if we want to be charitable, and lying through their teeth if we want to be accurate. And one more thing that breaks down public trust. I don't think it's as big a deal, but I think it's significant.
I mean, what do you think, Aaron? I feel like there are scientists who are willing to go along with this for the sake of, because actually, this is an important point, actually. One of the reasons why the scientists were very unwilling to be critical of the government was because they thought that for a pandemic response to work effectively, we need a unified message. And if we are to start sowing seeds of doubt publicly instead of privately within our professional meetings, what that is going to do is mix the message. People are going to get confused, and if people are confused, they don't necessarily respond well to a pandemic. Now, there is no way, now that Boris Johnson has stood up and said that what Dominic Cummings did was within the rules, that agreeing with the government saves a clear message, because the government have just trashed that clear message. So you have no professional justification whatsoever to now say the reason we're keeping quiet is because we think this is the best way to do pandemic control, because it's not. The best way to do pandemic control right now is say what he has just said to you, what Boris Johnson has just said to you, which is that Dominic Cummings was correct to use his instinct and drive 270 miles with coronavirus. That is wrong. And if you look at that and take that as an example of how you're going to behave over the next 6 months, people will die. If you have any professional integrity, you have to come out now and say that. And before I think the scientists should have been more critical earlier, because I think we should have gone into a lockdown earlier. And if they'd been more noisy, that would have happened. But they did have a justification back then, which was that they wanted to put forward a unified message. The government have now broken that contract, and it is time for them to, put their money where their mouth is.
I mean, you have to suspect that somebody will resign. You have to. I mean, surely that's going to happen, just purely as an outgrowth of their dissatisfaction at how it's been handled before even today. And I think today would be the coup de grace. Somebody has to resign. You cast your mind back to Iraq. The Labour sort of cabinet at the time, Robin Cook and Claire Short, resigned from cabinet. And I think, we will see a senior scientist go over this. The question is, will that then kind of create a domino effect? I think it probably would, because what are the downsides? So far people maybe felt inhibited for the reason you've just outlined. Another would be, oh, well, I'll be harassed and intimidated by the right-wing press. That's probably less likely to happen now after the Dominic Cummings stuff. And so I think there's a pretty good chance that you'll see dissent now from some of the sort of leading scientists on this.
Yeah. Let's go to some super chats. Ewan Goodfield, 666. Oh, I don't know if that's a reference. Cummings isn't going anywhere as things stand. Hardly feels like our outrage is enough. What else can we look at as a response? Interesting question. Tegan Talula, will people remember this at the next election with a fiver? Thank you very much. And Jake Sutton, £22.10. Thanks as always. Will Cummings' influence in number 10 take a hit? Let's address those questions very briefly. Aaron, do you think Cummings' influence will take a hit?
I have no idea. I don't know. It all depends on opinion polls. Look, if the next opinion polls show the Tories up 1, Labour standing still, kind of feeds into this bitter nihilism, which is all pervasive in British politics. If they suffer, then, you know, I think, I mean, they're ruthless people. He'll go.
I think it's difficult for Cummings' reputation to take a hit without Boris Johnson's, because Boris Johnson has so clearly connected himself to this man that it's almost, I mean, obviously one can go without the other going, but I mean, if Cummings goes, then Boris Johnson's reputation is
big
trashed
test.
almost as much as Cummings.
Well,
Ash.
let's just put it down bluntly. Boris Johnson is completely unfit to be prime minister. And I'm not just talking about politically. I'm saying that he lacks the personal caliber. He's not particularly hardworking. He's not particularly good at detail. He's not great at foresight. But what he is very good at is putting on a show, being the face of a brand, creating an emotional affect, and picking advisors who can tap into political antagonisms and craft an ideology for him. And that's where Cummings succeeded, right? And Cummings loved the stuff that bores Boris Johnson to tears. So Cummings loves taking a scalpel and a sledgehammer to Westminster bureaucracy and what they call the blob. So the kind of institutions that make up the, you know, structures of British public life. He loves doing that kind of thing. He loves micromanaging, being involved in every single step of every single decision. I don't think that we can really, you know, overestimate his centrality to the Johnson administration. And so were he to go, I think there would be a dearth of ideological drive and vision, though I think it is notable just how young, you know, much of Boris Johnson's team is, and the left should be worried about that, quite frankly. But no one with that kind of vision as Dominic Cummings, and he was able to sort of stabilize some quite contradictory impulses within Johnson's own shadow cabinet. You know, Rishi Sunak is very, very amenable to the Cummings program, but instinctively much more hawkish even than Sajid Javid on issues of deficit reduction. He's a low tax guy. He loves this idea of free ports. There've already been sort of, you know, hints of a rupture between himself and Matt Hancock on public spending during the lockdown. And so Cummings was able to, you know, I think either by charisma or brute force, reconcile those contradictions within the Conservative cabinet. Boris Johnson, without Cummings, he's got no work ethic. He's got no vision of his own. He's got no drive. He's got no desire beyond his own longing for power, prestige, and prominence. And that's the real issue. And that's why they're clinging to Cummings so hard, because the easy thing to do would be admit fault. Cummings resigns in a dignified fashion. He continues in an unpaid capacity, informally advising some of the key players in the cabinet. And then he comes back again when the stench of scandal has worn off. I mean, Peter Mandelson had to resign twice. Honestly, there's no upper limit in how often you can do this kind of shit in Westminster. Everyone's got goldfish memories. But that couldn't happen because he was too central to the operation to let go, even for a short amount of time.
Yeah. I think we'd normally end the show around now, but it's such a big news day. There's so much to discuss. And also there's so many of you watching that we are going to keep going. As ever, you know that this channel is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a donor, a subscriber, thank you so much. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. It is what makes this channel possible. It's how we can grow. And I do always notice that people get very generous when the mainstream media and the political establishment fuck up, because that is when we all really realize, boy, do we need an alternative. A couple of super chats, then we're going to go on to the Tory papers as one sort of key part of one of the linchpins that keeps Tory leaders and Tory advisors in place. If they all turn against him, things could change. They're currently split. Chris Hill with a whopping £50 super chat. Thank you so much. If Dominic Cummings doesn't want to go, can anyone make him go? Doesn't the Johnson wing of the Conservative Party rely on him for intellectual and ideological leadership? And Mickey Hack with a fiver. Given Kybix is so important to the government, what are your predictions if he stays or goes? And how can the government progress? Great show, by the way. Thank you very much. I'm going to answer those very, very quickly before going on to the papers, which is that I agree with Ash, which is that Boris Johnson, he has had executive positions before when he was London mayor. But what he likes to do is just be the sort of like friendly chairman who gets good PR and makes easy decisions. So he was like, oh, we'll get a new bus. And we'll build a bridge. You know, it's quite easy. You know, I don't want to make it sound too easy, but it's much easier being the mayor of London than it is governing Britain during a pandemic and when you were just about to break a trade deal, which we have had for 70 years, and try and refashion a whole new post-Brexit economy. Boris Johnson is up to neither of those things. He's not even interested in either of those things. That's why he misses all the Cobra meetings. That's why he doesn't read the details when it comes to Brexit, why he decided only the day before the referendum which side to back. So this is a guy who is a complete chancer. And, you know, whether or not you like Dominic Cummings or not, he has, you know, longer, more coherent thoughts than Boris Johnson bothers to have. And I think that is why he's so desperate to keep him, because he's worried what is going to be his purpose without that guy. I mean, we might think a Tory government without a purpose beyond, you know, minimizing death from this horrific pandemic is no bad thing. But in any case, let's go straight on to the papers, right? So one of the things that keeps the Tory party in power, in place, we often talk about this on the show, is the level of support they have on Fleet Street in the country's billionaire-owned press. And the establishment at the moment is split on this. So the Daily Mail yesterday led with this front page. I think we can get this up. What planet are they on? As Boris brazenly backs number 10 Svengali, who flouted PM's own strict lockdown rules, the question the whole country is asking. And also the comment actually was just as searing. In the clearest way, Dominic Cummings has violated the spirit and letter of the lockdown. In doing so, he has given every selfish person a license to play fast and loose with public health. Boris Johnson says he totally gets how the public feel about this. Clearly, he totally doesn't. Neither man has displayed a scintilla of contrition for this breach of trust. Do they think we are fools? For the good of the government and the nation, Mr. Cummings must resign or the Prime Minister must sack him. No ifs, no buts. And given what we've seen today, if that's the Daily Mail's position, I can't see them rolling back, because I can't see how anyone can possibly argue, beyond the cabinet ministers who are, you know, care nothing about truth or their own integrity, can argue that that was satisfactory, what we just heard. I'm just going to go to the Times before going to you, because this is the opposite end of the spectrum, a completely pathetic response, cowardly nonsense. This was the Times leader yesterday. Can we get this up? So, despite causing, well, we'll get it up in a moment, but the subheading, despite causing political embarrassment, Boris Johnson's advisor should stay, is the argument they make. And they say, Dr. Jenny Harries, England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, spoke at the government's daily press conference on March the 24th of the exceptional circumstance in which an adult with COVID-19 would be unable to care for a child. Mr. Cummings alleged further visits to Durham from London need to be investigated thoroughly, but the care of a father for a young child, a vulnerable individual in Dr. Harries' world and with a sick wife, should need no defence. So this is supposed to be an independent newspaper who is taking an independent journalistic, you know, a line with some sort of intellectual integrity, and they have basically been just as, you know, they're acting like all of those. I presume when Matt Hancock tweets that all that Dominic Cummings has done is the legitimate behaviour of a caring father, a little bit inside him dies, right? But he has to do that, because otherwise he's going to get sacked. There's no reason why the Times leader writers have to buy this bullshit and print it in the newspaper, which, you know, they are, you know, they're not forced to do this. Why would you destroy any integrity you have by saying that Dominic Cummings' actions, which so clearly broke the lockdown, everyone knows it, need no defence?
Can I respond to this?
I think, Aaron, I've been waiting for you to let loose.
No, I'll be super quick. 1997, the Sun backed Tony Blair. They didn't back Labour in 1997. So the Times, whatever happens, whatever the weather, if there's a crisis, they back the Tories. And that's what's happening now. So the likes of the Sun, they used to be a high circulation publication, as the Mail is now the biggest paper in the country, the first time in 40 years. They can't really afford to do that. The Times is much more of an ideological organ, as is the Telegraph. And so the Times, under absolutely no conditions, will rock the boat and undermine a Conservative government, given the scale of the crisis we're now going into, right? We're only, in many ways, we're only like 1/10 of the way into the coronavirus crisis, not just the public health implications and the political implications, but the economic implications and how it's going to reforge the political conversation in this country. And so at such a fragile moment, they're not going to go all in and demand that the chief political advisor for a Conservative Prime Minister goes.
Do you not think at this point in time, though, I suppose I'll direct this at Ash, that if you don't now come out in opposition to what Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are doing, you lose all credibility? I mean, the Sun especially, I mean, because there is no political divide here, really. Everyone has followed the lockdown rules: Leave, Remain, Labour, Tory, working class, middle class, degree education, non-degree education. And everyone has heard this justification and thinks it is nonsense. So 68% of the public said he had broken the lockdown rules, right? This is an overwhelming majority. So if you are a newspaper, which like the Sun sort of pretends to be a tribune of the people, or like the Times pretends to be the paper of record who sort of thinks critically about things, then how can you possibly tomorrow write a leader article which does anything other than condemn what Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings have just done?
Well, I think Aaron's explained it very well. These are ideological organs. And so the Times is not going to attack the sort of chief ideological engine and visionary for a Conservative government. In many ways, he's more central to the Conservatives being able to reinvent themselves through the long tail of the crisis of 2008, the split on its own benches because of Brexit. None of that would have been possible without Dominic Cummings. And so I think they'd be looking around saying there's no one that can fill his shoes. Absolutely no way are we going to make a move against him. But when it comes to the political strategy of it, this is the thing that I can't get my head around, is there is no fall from grace so permanent in Westminster that nobody can come back from it, right? You've seen it with Priti Patel, saw it with Gavin Williamson in a matter of weeks, saw it with Peter Mandelson so many times that I can scarcely keep track. From a comms perspective and a strategy perspective, I don't see why you wouldn't go for the dignified exit early on Friday, leaving the door open for him to come back. Other than he's too central to the functioning of government to be able to get away with it. But another golden rule of politics, as well as the advisor should never begin the story, is never, basically always do quickly what you'll be forced to do slowly. So spare yourself the bloodletting.
The thing this reminds me of, Aaron, or I think it is potentially what's going to happen, right? Is so what we heard about from Greece in 2015 was that you had basically a super majority who were in favor of sovereignty for Greece against the denial of democracy by the European establishment. And then you had a national press, a national corporate press, who sided with the oligarchs in the European Council. And that meant that they lost a great deal of legitimacy in the public press, because they hadn't taken a position which was a left-right one. They'd taken a position which was sovereignty versus the end of democracy. And because they went so hard on that, people just stopped believing what they said. And it feels almost here like we've got another supermajority issue. The fact that leaders shouldn't break lockdowns they've enforced is a supermajority issue. There's no partisan divide. So it does seem like this is going to be a real risky moment for the Times and the Sun. I mean, they might be now calling up Boris Johnson saying, you're making our lives really fucking difficult because we'll back you to the hilt, but we don't want you to make us look like complete idiots. And what you are doing right now is making us look like complete idiots. It's a threat to our business model even, I mean, do you think we could be facing that now? Or am I being
no? I agree. I mean, it intersects as well with the we had some of the ABCs out, which is the newspaper circulations out last week. Normally that would have been a big story to talk about today, but of course events have overtaken it. And so no, you're absolutely right. I mean, they're already facing Armageddon anyway. I mean, Christ, can you imagine being a newspaper owner now? They're facing business Armageddon, and now they're having to defend the indefensible and a very, very, very unpopular political figure. No, it doesn't make sense. I agree with you. I think, like I say, the second Tory polling goes down, I think they'll cut Dominic Cummings loose. And that has all the problems attendant with it that we've talked about tonight. Had it not been for Dominic Cummings, the Tories somehow came out of a 30-year EU crisis, not just not splitting, not just not being absolutely destroyed for a generation, but with a majority of 80. And that was because of him. And so you don't just disregard somebody like that easily.
I think Fox is saying we've got some front pages. Obviously, most of them come out around 10 p.m. But I think we've got the Metro. Oh, but give him 30 seconds. I mean, it's going to be super interesting to see how any of them can sort of fashion this. It just seems really difficult for me to how anyone can justify this other than Tom Harwood. I mean, it's been very notable. He's the only person the BBC can get on television to defend the Conservative.
Not even Dan
Tom
Hodges.
Harwood. Yeah.
I mean, I very rarely do talk radio. I know that you've been a bit of a regular on talk radio, Michael. So I was a bit unfamiliar with that sort of, modus operandi. And so I agreed to do the Downing Street briefing reaction, and then ended up having to do it after Cummings, but before Johnson. And I was up with Darren Grimes, and because it wasn't Dan Wootton, it was Mark Dolan. I thought, oh well, he's not going to be quite as deranged as Dan Wootton, so I'll probably get a fair hearing. And as always, I was listening to the lead-in, and he's selecting tweets and responses, and the majority of them are pro Cummings responses, and I was like, that doesn't seem that representative of the temperature of the country, but we'll go with it. And then we get into the conversation itself, and he's literally using the words triumph. He's saying, Ash, isn't this a triumph? Going into the question of Darren Grimes, right? And he's not just being a contrarian, for me, right? He's saying to Darren Grimes, lots of people are going to come out of that, thinking that was a really positive showing for Dominic Cummings. And I'd honestly felt like I dropped a tab of acid without realizing, and had just started tripping, because I was like, what did you watch? I watched, brittle, irritable, and quite nervy advisor trying to sort of claw his way out of a corner, refusing to apologize or really grapple with the hurt that many people are feeling in this country. I was looking at an absurd lie being woven and sort of remade before our very eyes, even as it crumbles. How on earth is that a positive performance? How is that even a triumph? And what I realized is that it is completely unreasonable and naive of me to expect any shred of integrity or even pride from some of these media outlets. They were trailing Mike Graham's show before that, and so it was all this anti-lockdown and anti-union stuff. These are purely ideological outlets, right? It's sort of that nihilistic, it's sort of like for death drive gammons, that's their target audience. And they will do anything to construct, maintain, and reinforce that worldview. It honestly feels like Alice stepping through the looking glass.
It's not Fox News, though, in the sense that it doesn't speak to half the nation. So whilst it's trying to be Fox News, so their style of journalism, their opinions, completely Fox News, but Fox News speaks to half of America, which is why Donald Trump can stand up in front of press conferences and just tell outright lies. But if the listening figures for talk radio are low, and there isn't a comparison of that which is big enough to make this work, I think.
I mean, it's because our broadcasting rules are so different in the UK.
Yeah.
And I think maybe talk radio is looking to experiment a bit with the kind of, extremely partisan shock jock format. Now, in a way, us at Novara Media have tried to do the left-wing version of that. Although I think that we've got perhaps a little bit more skill and dexterity than being merely shock jocks. But I think quite obviously we're partisan, right? We hold left-wing values very, very dear to our heart. We've had to do that on a shoestring budget, right? So almost entirely donation and subscriber funded. And that means that, we sometimes have, these technical issues, or one of our face colors is a bit off because the camera is wonky or something like that, right? It's quite clear that we're dealing with limited resources, and I'm really happy with what we're able to produce. Talk radio's got a small audience share, but they've got far bigger resources, and in terms of the kind of people that they're bringing on board and the kind of fiefdom that they're trying to establish for themselves, I think it's it's one to watch, because I think that they are going to, more and more shape the opinion of that authoritarian, nationalist, clogged artery beating heart of British politics. And I think that, if Dominic Cummings, falls from grace and there's a scramble for like the ideological identity of the government, that kind of, real wild-eyed authoritarianism, I think, will have outlets like Talk Radio right at the forefront, gunning for it.
Let's be super quick. I think LBC and Talk Radio are probably the two worst political developments, sort of media developments in this country for the last 10 years. I like the call-in show. We'd love to do a call-in show. It's a great genre, but it's a weird that they have this kind of this cipher. The average sort of presenter for these shows is a 65-year-old guy who thinks that smoking 40 cigarettes a day is a political statement of freedom. That's not normal. Right? Most people don't be. This is freedom. This is freedom. I get to smoke 40 Marlboro Lights, and I can drink, and I can tell people to go fuck themselves. This is like a kind of weird niche thing. And Ash is right. If Novara Media had the resources of Talk Radio, my God, we'd be huge. We'd be biggest Channel 4. I shouldn't say that because, Gary will say, don't make promises you can't keep. But it's true. And I think the fact they do have these resources and they don't have a bigger reach speaks to the fact that it's not really a large organic politics. It remains quite limited. However, that can change.
Aaron's just given you that a great reason to go to novaramedia.com/support and help us expand our size. So yeah, that we can compete with those kind of resources. Let's get up the Metro front page because it is a good one. Can we get this up? Stay elite is a very good play on that slogan, to be on the front of. I think that is actually the newspaper with the widest circulation in the country because it's free, obviously.
No, not after last month.
Oh, not after last. Oh, yeah,
it fell like 70% or something crazy. It was the biggest fall.
No one gets on public transport, so why would you sell the Metro?
But it's owned by the same people that own the Daily Mail, so it's kind of a big thing for the Metro to say that. It means that the Mail Group, that's their line. So the Mail might get even worse from a Conservative Party perspective.
Okay, we got 4,600 people watching it, 1.8k likes. Let's get that up to 2k while we're live. We've been going for 90 minutes. We normally do an hour show, but we're going to do one more story because it is a really important one. In human terms, more important than this Dominic Cummings one. But obviously the same people are involved. Let's go to the start of this. So this was an article in the Sunday Times yesterday. So this was from their Insight team. They broke a really great story about 5 weeks ago. They've been talking to lots of the central people in the government response to coronavirus and often outing and shedding light on the mistakes that were made along the way and also the reasons they were made. Why was it that people were so complacent at the top of government for this incredibly serious issue? The headline was 3 weeks of diver and delay on coronavirus that cost thousands of British lives. There are sort of two elements to this story. So one of them is new modelling, which has shown sort of quite how catastrophic the delay to the lockdown was. The second part is why it took so long for that lockdown to be introduced. So we'll start on that first bit, which is that a team from Oxford and Imperial used the dates of death from COVID to work out when people were most likely to have been infected. So they're sort of doing a post facto analysis or a reverse engineered analysis of how many people had coronavirus at any one period of time back in March. And I think we can get a graphic of that, which is showing sort of that exponential curve of how much that delay in the lockdown cost us. And sort of what they've worked out or what they've suggested is that when the government started to realize the significance of the problem on the 14th of March, and from then to the 23rd of March, the infected total rose from 200,000 to 1.5 million people. So Boris Johnson sort of delaying on imposing that lockdown is what they say why we have the highest death toll in Europe. Actually, let's go to that quote. Those 20 days of government delay are the single most important reason why the UK has the second highest number of deaths from coronavirus in the world. This is after speaking to numerous experts, sources close to the top of government, and these people who did this model. This next graph, well, shocking. You can see here a direct correlation between who had the most infections when they locked down and the deaths we've ended up seeing. So you can see there that the UK, they locked down when we had according to their modeling, more infections than any other country in Europe. And it's probably no coincidence that the order these countries are in is the same order that the deaths have been. So the UK has had more deaths than Italy, which has had more deaths than Spain, which has had more deaths than France, which has had more deaths than Germany. So it seems like the strongest correlation between how many people die in your country is how early you do the lockdown. Our country was extraordinarily slow when it came to locking down. A few final nuggets of sort of the cost of that delay. So on the Cheltenham Festival and the Liverpool versus Atletico Madrid match, the article brings up research from Edge Health, which analyzes health data for the NHS. Can we get up this quote now? So they carried out modelling that estimated that the match and the Cheltenham Festival, which is that horse race, are linked to 41 and 37 additional deaths respectively at nearby hospitals between 25 and 35 days later, compared with similar hospital trusts that were used as a control. That was just the local hospitals. So this is saying that these events, which they said at the time, have been directly linked to an increase in deaths in those areas of the country, and sort of in the time frame which one would expect, whereby disease, viruses spread, and those events would carry through into hospital admissions and ultimately, sadly, people dying from them. Okay, so why did it take so long? And here what we hear is that actually the scientists had been telling them for much longer than we previously believed that the current actions they were taking were going to have appalling consequences. Let's go to this quote now. So this is why they took so long. So teams from Imperial College London and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine both concluded separately that if the mitigation measures under the delay strategy were followed, it could result in about 250,000 deaths. They delivered papers detailing those findings to a meeting of SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, on March the 3rd, attended by government officials. And here, obviously, it's probably known, it's not news to our audience that there was modelling from these two universities, which I think the London School of Tropical Hygiene said 200,000. Imperial said 250,000. If the government mitigation strategy, the delay strategy, was pursued. So without a radical change in government strategy, that would be how many people died. We knew that modelling existed. But up to now, we believed that was shown to the government for the first time on the 16th of March. And that's why that was the research on the basis of which Laura Kuenssberg was saying the science has changed. The policy has changed from herd immunity to lockdown because the science has changed. Turns out the science changed 2 weeks prior to that, and they sat on it whilst the number of infections was exponentially rising. And in explanation as to why this sort of, why when they saw these sums originally, they didn't say, well, maybe we could have less than 200,000 deaths if we did something like a lockdown, because the government never asked these scientific modelers to model a lockdown. They ultimately ended up doing it of their own accord because they were so worried by government inaction and inertia on this. So let's get a quote from someone who is close to both the Imperial and the LSTMH modelling teams at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. So they said, I think an overarching concern and why so much time was spent looking at alternatives involving mitigation and shielding was that everyone, especially Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, and the policy people, knew what the economic and social costs of a lockdown would be. So you've got people here who are saying, well, but given the cost of a lockdown, maybe 200,000 people is an acceptable number of people we should allow to die. That's why we have the highest death toll in Europe. One final quote I'll go to before I go to you two. So this is someone who sits on SAGE. So someone who is, this is Professor Peter Openshaw, a member of the government's NERV-TAG, so the New and Emerging Respiratory Virus Threats Advisory Groups. This is one of the key bodies advising the government. He said to the authors of this article, many of us on the scientific advisory committees were quite keen that action should be taken a couple of weeks before action actually was taken. I think that critical period of delay made the big difference to the peak numbers, both of hospitalizations and of deaths. I think everyone would accept now in retrospect that if we'd gone for lockdown a couple of weeks earlier, that would have greatly reduced the numbers of hospitalizations and deaths. So that story again by that Sunday Times Insight team, the last one was incredibly damaging to the government as well. They are going through previous records of SAGE meetings. They're talking to people at the top of government, scientific advisors, civil servants, people who were there. And what they are saying is that the inertia of the government, because they were worried about economic cost or social cost, depending on who you're talking about, that is why we entered a lockdown extraordinarily late. We were an outlier, and why also in terms of death toll, this country will be an absolute complete outlier. I mean, none of this is a surprise, but I feel like it is starting to dawn to the public that our government here have really fucked up. And I mean, potentially now, to add insult to injury, they've fucked up and they're now pissing all over us. I mean, what do you make of this story and how it relates to what we've been talking about all weekend? Is it almost a shame that this isn't the headline news and instead we're talking about the stupidity of Dominic Cummings?
Well, it all sounds like a load of hipster analysis, if you ask me. The kind of unproductive questioning of government policy, which, I mean, so looking at this from the Sunday Times, I think it shows us that, one, the lack of transparency throughout this entire process of coordinating the government pandemic response has cost lives. So when in early to mid-March, there were demands from Labour, with Jeremy Corbyn as leader back then, for openness about what kind of discussions were going on in SAGE and what was the scientific modelling being used to dictate the UK's pandemic response. Actually, had that happened and we had some public oversight at the time, we could have forced the government into taking earlier action, much swifter and more decisive action, in a way that would have probably saved thousands of lives. And I agree with you, it is actually a shame that this whole Dominic Cummings furore has knocked this really important piece of investigative journalism off the news agenda entirely. And just now, it's been confirmed that the UK has got the world's worst, coronavirus death rate per million people. The next worst, by the way, is Sweden, for all of those, anti-lockdown ideologues out there. And it's because we looked at the guidance coming from the World Health Organization. We looked at the fact that our NHS had been sort of stripped of central planning capacity, that our state wasn't up to much, and the prioritization of, growth at any other cost, and decided that we could go it alone and be an outlier. And the data that was behind that position was never really very strong, and we didn't have a great deal of scrutiny from our press at that time, and that's how they were able to get away with so much.
Aaron,
is it a shame that this has been overshadowed by the Cummings story? I'm not so sure. I think the personal stories are very important, and I think the big macro reality of what's going on is also very important. I tweeted this earlier on today. We are now double counting tests. So it turns out that despite the government's often hyperbolic claims, we've never had a single day in this country so far where 100,000 people have been tested. And what we're doing is we're double counting the tests. So if you have like a swab test and a nasal test, that's 2 tests, but it's obviously only 1 person. And that's what's happening. So you might have 160,000 tests, but in reality, it's 80,000 people being tested. So we had double accounting for gloves, because a pair of gloves is apparently 2 gloves. And people say that's a normal way of accounting for gloves. But when the government's talking about 1 million pieces of PPE, 1 glove without the other isn't very good in terms of keeping medical professionals safe. We had double accounting for gloves. We've had 21 million masks go unaccounted for. We had absolutely no stockpiling of aprons. We had one of the depots of stockpiled PPE with asbestos. We purchased a load of tests which didn't work. Everything that's gone wrong in terms of the government's intervention in this thing has gone wrong. Absolutely everything. NHS Nightingale, they built it, they got the hardware in, but then they couldn't get the actual people in. Turns out they built them as spare capacity for a crisis, which didn't actually rear its head because we had the lockdown. There's just so much that has gone wrong. And it's a major, 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 major story. But I don't think that detracts from the Dominic Cummings stuff. And what it tells me is actually, and this is a really, I always thought, for whatever criticisms I had of the Conservative Party, I always thought when it came to the nuts and bolts of running a state, I never thought we'd have a Hurricane Katrina-style catastrophe in this country through poor political administration. Hurricane Katrina, of course, was just a natural disaster. There's no such thing as a natural sort of tragedy. You have a natural disaster, and whether or not it becomes a tragedy is down to the political oversight of the government of the day. And that's precisely what happened with Hurricane Katrina. They turn a natural disaster into a natural tragedy. And we're doing the same thing here. And I'll finish with this. We had the ever glorious Dan Hodges about 2 weeks ago say, oh, I wonder how bad it's going to be in Venezuela when coronavirus gets there. Well, you know how many people have died from coronavirus in Venezuela, Dan? 10. Because it turns out the interventions you need to do to keep people safe aren't particularly expensive. You know, that's why countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Eastern European countries, Greece, have actually done Kerala, have done extraordinarily well in terms of controlling this thing. You know, it's not about how wealthy you are. You know, the wealthiest country on earth, the United States, has done arguably as bad a job as we have. Although Ash is right, in terms of deaths per million, I think we're doing worse than them. 100,000 people have died in the US, by the way. You know, it's easy to forget that you know, about 60,000 people died in the Vietnam War. Soon the United States are going to see the number of people who died from this overtake the number of casualties that suffered during World War I. You know, if it goes past, say, World War II style numbers, which is about 400,000, this is a huge moment. And we have to put it in that context of a political and economic model neoliberalism, where the governing elites, often working in the interests of millionaires and billionaires, always think markets are better than states. And that's what this all boils down to. It's how Kerala and Vietnam and Eastern European countries do a better job, and Venezuela do a better job at controlling this than the United States, than Sweden, than America, than Britain.
Going to go to a few super chats. Jacqueline de Blue with a £50 super chat. Thank you so much. Kunal Patel with 100 quid. Your journalism keeps me going through these frustrating times. How do we keep hope for 5 years with an 80-seat majority, until they change the fixed-term parliament legislation? They already did, but maybe they brought it back. In any case, we're going to be building left-wing institutions to hold this government to account, so that we can have serious impact on party politics when Labour win their general election in 2024. And also, you know, there's plenty we can do, especially now that this government have shown what contempt they have for the public. I think this is now going to be, I mean, it's clear now. They were hiding it a bit better before. Yeti Face 14 with a €20 super chat. Take my money, comrades. Left last year because of the Tories. Seeing this just really shows how incompetent these people are. Chances and Pillocks, a lot of them watching from Ireland in disgust. Thank you for that, Yeti Face. And thank you for everyone who donates at novaramedia.com/support. We are, you know, this show is possible because of our subscribers. If you do donate to us, well, an hour's wage a month or whatever you donate to us, or any one-off chats, any these things on the super chats, these are what makes this show possible and why we can have a left-wing alternative to the nonsense that our establishment keeps throwing at us relentlessly. Ash and Aaron, you've been brilliant. Always a pleasure. Thank you for watching tonight. We'll be back on Wednesday night. Aaron is back tomorrow, though, with Rutger Bregman. We did promise that last week. It ended up not happening. It is definitely happening tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I'll be back on Wednesday. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.